another documentation-related issue with a client who presents with suicidal ideation over time, but now it's no longer an issue. How long do you keep documenting that you are inquiring regarding this issue? Well, it may be that my has covered that, but to reiterate, I would, with all clients, suicidal or not, I would just do a very brief notation about no crises or emergencies. It doesn't have to be as specific as I'm doing suicidal evaluations. When you have a client who's suicidal, though, you want to be and it can be 2 or 3 or 5 years later that a new suicidal episode emerges. And as some of you know, clients may not be willing. So the questions are checking in. But it doesn't have to be, you know, kind of artless or kind of blunt, and checking in and saying, any emergencies, anything coming up that I should be aware of? I think, you know, again, it has to do with how you structure this. You don't have to automate it to set up a form for yourself and to have that form have check marks, or, you know, where you can list the goal or objective that you've been working on. You don't have to then write it out by hand again. You can simply say, and then just a couple, 3 sentences about the content of the session. Okay, so that's the way I make it more efficient for myself in having to keep a lot of this information. And I want to keep it relatively brief, unless there's an incident that's occurred. And also I want to have it be geared towards, what do I need to remind myself of? When I talk about the continuity of care, and I often think about what happens if I need to disclose to you know, a third party some information that will help them in providing services, or what happens if something happens to me. But I'll tell you, particularly in the last 3 or 4 years, you know, of course, it's not at all age-related, I'm not remembering the sessions when I see 5 or 6 or 10 or 12 couples a week. They begin to blend together. So it's important for my own continuity of care to know what the content was, and I can do that usually by giving you know, myself some keywords or quotes that. What about written, signed, informed consent, etc. With classes we offer, say parenting classes, couples communication, and so on, but do not keep individual records for participants. Yeah, I would keep a record in writing of what that you let people know what they were getting into. So I tend to be a real fan of doing informed consent for whatever services we're offering, even if they're not the kind of service that we're providing kind of individually based or family-based interventions or couple-based interventions. In the examples here, say parenting classes, you're not going to, you know, you're not going to do a therapy note. These are classes, but you do want people to know what they're getting into. And when you do parenting classes, often, not always, but often there are implications. CPS may say, well, did so-and-so attend? That's a critical component to the reunification plan. So having a record of their attendance, and also that they signed up and they knew what they were getting into, is useful. You know, one of the ways of thinking about course information forms is that they're an informed consent document. They're not quite a contract because they can be changed unilaterally, but the consent process. And so I do think it's wise to have what would I write down in this narrative? Well, I'll try to anonymize this as best I can, but for a couple that I saw recently, one of the notes that I kept, I put in the usual information and that sort of thing. And then the narrative, I had 3 sentences, about 3 sentences. The first sentence was a quotation. And the quote was the man's statement to the wife, you always treat me like that, you always treat me like I'm a child, which encapsulated their 10 sessions previously, but in a great statement. So I put that in a quotation mark, and then followed up with something like, couple's main focus was on the conflict they have around the sense that X, the feels infantilized by Y, and Y's sense that X isn't responsible. Okay. And I think the last sentence I used in that particular narrative was, we remind my self-notes for me in terms of the narrative are exactly what you want to be writing. It does, however, mingle the medical and psychotherapy record. So if you're comfortable with having your notes seen by clients and disclosed of work that you do, and really less privacy protection than a psychotherapy note, SOAP note is fine. For those who were not trained doing SOAP notes are writing a note about the subjective, objective, an assessment, and plan. Notice it doesn't include all of the information that I've mentioned, but it's certainly having a strength and weakness, current functioning is not at all unusual. And I actually like doing that at the outset. If you use a strength-based approach, whether it's a narrative approach, cognitive behavioral, or solution-focused, it really helps us keep focused on what strengths we identified initially, and not just the problem areas or difficulties, but also what resources can the client bring to. Also related to records is the question, in keeping medical records and psychotherapy notes, do you have to keep them in separate folders? I've heard you can keep them separate by keeping the medical records on one flap of a folder and the psychotherapy notes on the other flap of the folder. Knowledge, this has not been tested in court. And so we don't know what's going to be considered a reasonable distinction of a psychotherapy note and a medical record. Part of what makes this so vexing for us is that most of us psychotherapists have never kept a separate medical record and don't think of our records as being medical records. We think of them as being psychotherapy records, right? So what are we talking about now that we've got to create notes or records? And it's one of the reasons among others that I have certainly considered becoming more automated. But in this context, when we have a medical record, makes sense at this point in history to have it physically separated in such a way as to not have people be able to make any argument that it's inappropriately part of the medical record and therefore it is now to be considered part of the medical record.